Night Shift Nancy. That's what the day staff called her when they thought she couldn't hear. Megan O'Brien moved through the fluorescent corridors of Mercy General in San Antonio at 2:51 a.m., her scrubs crisp, her movements economical, never rushed, never hurried. The hallway smelled of antiseptic and something metallic underneath, the particular stench of a hospital ward at the hour when most people were supposed to be sleeping. Her slight limp was barely visible unless you knew what you were looking for, a barely perceptible hitch in her gait that disappeared when she concentrated. Which was always. She'd been working the night shift for 3 months now. The hospital had hired her on provisional credentials while her licensing paperwork cleared, and the day nurses had made it their collective hobby to remind her of that fact. Just a temp. Just a night shift fill-in. Just the girl who'd never quite fit into their ecosystem of hierarchy and institutional memory. Megan had learned long ago that people saw what they expected to see. They saw the limp and thought weakness. They saw the scarred hands and looked away quickly, as if the burns might be contagious. They heard her quiet voice and assumed silence meant absence of capability. She was wrong about one thing. What they actually saw depended entirely on their own fears. The VA ward occupied the east wing of the 3rd floor, 12 beds arranged in 2 neat rows beneath lights that hummed with the constancy of a machine that never stopped working. Room 347 was at the far end, separated slightly from the others by a partition that someone had moved there months ago to give the occupant a measure of privacy. The man inside, rank, sergeant, service record, sealed by the Veterans Affairs Office, hadn't spoken a word in 18 months. The nurses on day shift had stopped trying to engage him. They changed his dressing, monitored his vitals, and moved on. It was efficient. It was also, Megan thought, a particular kind of cruelty wrapped in institutional procedure. She entered his room without announcing herself. Room 347 occupied it by now, that particular attention to presence that came from years of moving through spaces where announcing yourself got people killed. The Army Ranger's eyes tracked her movement from the moment she crossed the threshold, sharp and aware despite the morphine drip. His name was classified in her chart, replaced by his unit designation. He'd survived something bad. The quality of scarring visible on his neck suggested a blast injury, the kind that didn't kill you but took things away anyway. Megan placed a cup of water on the bedside table and adjusted the plastic cup so the straw bent toward him at an accessible angle. She didn't speak. She didn't patronize him with false cheerfulness or motivational statements about recovery. She simply placed the water within his reach and then moved to check his foredrip, her fingers steady as she verified the flow rate on the pump. 12 milliliters per hour. Correct. The saline line was clear, no cloudiness, no sign of infection. His vitals on the monitor were stable. Heart rate 68. Blood pressure 118/76. Oxygen saturation 97% on room air. It was then that her eyes caught the keychain. Attached to her scrubs, clipped to the pocket where she kept her penlight and trauma shears, hung a military challenge coin. Tarnished. Dull silver with verdigris patina that spoke of years carried through sand and rain and things she would never tell anyone about. She'd forgotten she was wearing it, which happened sometimes when exhaustion accumulated past the point of situational awareness. The ranger's attention locked onto that coin like a targeting laser finding coordinates. His hand moved. Slow. Deliberate. He reached out and his fingers nearly touched the coin before Megan stepped back. Not in alarm. Not in anything that could be mistaken for distress. Simply a lateral movement, a recalibration of distance. His hand fell back to the bed. The moment held for 3 seconds. Then Megan checked the rest of his lines and exited the room with the same economy of motion she'd used entering it. The nurse's station occupied the center of the ward, a half-circle desk arrangement where charts were filed, medication logs were reviewed, and the machinery of patient care hummed its endless rhythm. Megan settled into the desk chair at 3:14 a.m., the time she noted precisely in her mind, a habit that had never quite left her, and opened the medication log for the VA ward. The leather of the desk chair creaked slightly beneath her weight. Fluorescent light overhead cast everything in a particular shade of clinical white that made it difficult to distinguish truth from exhaustion. The first discrepancy appeared in line 3 of the log. Patient 347 of VA was documented as receiving 10 milligrams of morphine sulfate at 1800 hours. The administration note was clear. Time. Dose. Route, intravenous. But when Megan cross-referenced the entry against the patient's actual treatment chart, the medication record showed no administration at that time. There was an administration recorded at 2,100 hours instead. A different dose. 7.5 milligrams. Different route, intramuscular. She turned the page. Line 7. Patient 301 VA documented as receiving metoprolol 50 milligrams at 2,000 hours. The treatment chart showed no record of metoprolol administration at all. Instead, there was documentation of atenolol, 25 milligrams, given at 2,200 hours. Two different medications. Different doses. Different times. The pattern wasn't random. It was systematic. Megan pulled the medication logs from the previous 2 weeks. Her hands remained steady as she spread the papers across the desk, arranging them in chronological order. The discrepancies multiplied. Not every entry. Not enough to trigger an automatic alarm. But enough that someone, at some point, had been falsifying records. The medications documented in the official logs didn't match the medications actually administered. The question was whether the logs were wrong or the actual treatment was. She was still reviewing the documents at 4:07 a.m. when the sound of expensive cologne arrived before the man wearing it did. Dr. Leonard Hargrove materialized at the edge of the nurse's station like something that had been waiting for its moment. He wore a bespoke suit, wool, navy, cost more than Megan earned in a month, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine. His watch was a Rolex. His medical bag was Italian leather. Everything about him communicated a particular species of confidence, the kind that came from institutional power and the certainty that his position in the hierarchy would never be questioned. He was in his early 50s, with silver threading through his dark hair in a way that probably required a colorist to maintain. His eyes were the color of winter, and they focused on the papers spread across her desk with the intensity of a man who had just noticed something that required his immediate attention. Hargrove didn't speak. He simply reached down and picked up the medication log from the previous week, his eyes scanning the discrepancies Megan had been documenting. She watched his jaw tighten. Watched the small muscle near his temple twitch once, twice. Watched something dangerous pass across his features, not anger exactly, but the kind of calculation that came from a man realizing he'd been caught in something he'd worked very hard to conceal. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Somewhere in the building, a bed alarm chimed. The ventilation system exhaled stale air through vents that hadn't been cleaned in weeks. Hargrove set the log down with extreme care and looked directly at Megan for the first time. His gaze moved across her face like he was reading something written in a language he'd forgotten but could still decipher. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She sat perfectly still, her hands resting on the desk, her breathing unchanged. The mask was perfect. Impenetrable. The same mask she'd learned to wear in a place where showing weakness meant someone didn't come home. "Night shift," Hargrove said. His voice was pleasant. Professional. Underneath the pleasantness was something that sounded like a threat pretending to be a compliment. That's what we call comprehensive attention to detail. He replaced the log in its folder and walked away without waiting for a response. Megan watched him go. She didn't move. She didn't react. But her hands, those scarred hands that had learned to hold things together in the dark, remained absolutely steady as she returned to her work. What happened in the next 24 hours would change everything. The conference room at Mercy General was packed with residents and junior staff when Dr. Hargrove walked in, designer shoes clicking against the tile with the kind of precision that said he owned the room. It was 7:51 a.m., and he was already smiling, the kind of smile that meant someone was about to have a very bad week. Megan sat in the third row, her posture perfect, her hands folded on the table in front of her. She'd learned not to make herself smaller in rooms like this. Small drew attention. Invisible was the goal. Hargrove set his leather portfolio down with ceremony, the kind of gesture designed to make sure everyone was watching. Then he pulled out a crisp $50 bill, held it up to the light like he was admiring a fine painting, and placed it deliberately on the conference table with the kind of finality that made the air in the room shift. "The new nurse with no real credentials," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "will be transferred to rotating shifts effective immediately. 6 days on, 4 off. Nights, days, floors." He looked around the room, making eye contact with each resident, building the moment. "She'll last a week. Maybe. Any of you care to wager?" Nervous laughter rippled through the room like a contagion. Someone made a joke. Someone else leaned toward a colleague and whispered something that made them both grin. The $50 bill sat on the table untouched, a challenge and a prophecy all at once. Megan's jaw tightened. Just once. A single muscle contraction that lasted less than a second. Everything else remained exactly as it was, spine straight, hands still folded, eyes forward. No one saw the tightening except Hargrove, and when he caught it, his smile deepened. He'd been looking for a reaction. This was close enough to count as one. What he didn't see was the calculation behind her eyes. Rotating shifts meant unpredictable sleep. Unpredictable sleep meant slower reaction times. Slower reaction times meant mistakes in the med logs, mistakes he was counting on her to make. He was herding her toward a cliff and placing bets on which day she'd jump. She understood exactly what was happening. The question wasn't whether she understood. The question was what she would do about it. 2 days later, the hospital cafeteria was at full lunch rush, 80 staff members moving through the line, carrying trays, finding tables. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a sick pale yellow. The smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with something vaguely meat-based wafted from the kitchen. It was Thursday, a second rotating shift, and Megan had just finished a grueling morning in the VA ward where the medication log showed 3 more discrepancies since the start of her week. She was sitting alone at a corner table, eating methodically, consuming calories because her body needed them, not because she was hungry. Her badge was still clipped to her scrubs. Her hands were clean. She was thinking about the timing, how long Hargrove would give her before making his next move. He came around the corner carrying a stack of files like he was in a hurry, engaged in conversation with 2 residents about the importance of maintaining hospital standards. His trajectory would take him directly past her table. The distance was calculated. The timing was perfect. He knocked her tray from her hands. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't an accident. His forearm connected with the edge of the tray and sent it airborne, soup splashing across 3 feet of tile, a sandwich landing face down, the plastic cup spinning like it was choreographed. Food scattered everywhere. The noise of the impact made heads turn. 20 people stopped what they were doing. 30 people's peripheral vision registered the scene. Hargrove didn't break stride. Didn't apologize. Didn't even pause his conversation. He kept walking, kept talking about prescribing protocols and standards, his voice smooth as marble. The cafeteria went quiet. That specific kind of quiet that happens when people are waiting to see what someone does after they've been publicly humiliated. Megan's hands didn't shake. This was important. This was the moment that mattered. Her hands remained steady as a surgical laser as she pushed her chair back. Her breathing stayed even. Her face remained a perfect mask, not blank, not cold, but completely neutral, the way someone looks when they're simply resolving a problem. She knelt down, picked up the pieces of the tray, gathered the scattered food with deliberate precision. A resident she recognized from pediatrics looked uncomfortable, actually made a move to help. She waved him off with a single gesture, a small shake of her head, and continued alone. By the time she stood up, carrying the ruined tray toward the disposal bin, Hargrove was gone and the cafeteria had returned to its normal volume. But something had shifted. People could feel it. They just didn't know what it was yet. That evening, outside the pharmacy on the 3rd floor, Hargrove was waiting. He had timing down to a science. He knew her schedule, her official schedule, the one he'd given her, and he knew exactly when she'd be passing this corridor. He was leaning against the wall with 4 residents clustered nearby, discussing a patient case with the kind of authority that made everyone in earshot believe he was handling something important. When Megan approached, he pulled a patient chart from his stack and tossed it directly at her feet. Not a gentle drop. Not an accident. A deliberate toss designed to scatter the papers. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice carrying the full weight of mock concern. "And next time, try actually reading the orders before you question my prescriptions." The papers scattered. 17 pages across the tile floor. The residents exchanged glances. One of them, a guy named Patterson, started to smirk. The others followed his lead. Megan bent down. Her hands moved with the kind of precision that made the bending look like part of her job, not part of her punishment. She gathered each page methodically, one by one, reading them as she went. Dosages, patient names, times, signatures. All of it went into her memory the same way it would go into a permanent record. When she stood, the chart was complete and in her hands. Her face was still that perfect mask. Not angry. Not cowed. Not anything at all. Just present. "Thank you, doctor," she said quietly. Her voice was soft, deliberately deferential, but there was something underneath it that made Patterson's smirk fade. Something like the calm that comes from having already survived the worst. Hargrove laughed, turned back to his residence, and continued his conversation like she'd already left. But he was watching her in his peripheral vision, looking for another crack in the facade. He didn't find one. She walked past them all, returned the chart to where it belonged, and continued her rounds without missing a single vital sign. What Hargrove didn't notice was that Dr. Patel had been standing in the pharmacy doorway the entire time. Patel, who'd served as a combat medic with the 160th SAW, who'd seen field medicine practiced under fire, who knew what composure actually looked like. He watched the way Megan gathered those papers, the efficiency, the controlled breathing, the way her eyes tracked the information even as her hands worked. He watched the way she stood, the way she carried herself after Hargrove dismissed her. Something clicked behind his eyes. Not a suspicion. Recognition. That night, Megan sat alone in her car in the third-level parking garage at 11:43 p.m. The engine was off. The lights were off. She was holding the challenge coin in her palm, the tarnished one with the embossed insignia worn almost smooth from 40 years of being carried. The metal was cold. It always was at this hour. Room 347 was on the 3rd floor. An Army Ranger who hadn't spoken in 18 months. She'd seen his chart while making rounds, massive trauma, tracheal damage, complete psychological shutdown. The kind of patient who got moved between hospitals and observation units because no one knew what to do with someone who was medically stable but completely unreachable. She'd passed his window 3 times that day. The 3rd time, his eyes had tracked to her keychain where the challenge coin hung, and something in his face had changed. Just barely. Just enough. She turned the coin over in her hands. Baghdad, 2006. Operation Phantom Fury. 23 Marines in her unit. She was the only one who'd made it home in one piece. The challenge coin was given to survivors only. It meant you'd earned it through fire and blood and refusal to break. The parking garage was silent except for the occasional car passing on a lower level, the sound carrying upward through the concrete structure like an echo from another world. She sat there for 20 minutes, holding that coin, and thought about what Patel had said in the scrub room. Baghdad, 2006. Different unit. But I know field surgery when I see it. He'd asked her where she served. She'd lied and told the truth in the same breath. I didn't. A single statement that meant everything and nothing. Meanwhile, in his office on the 4th floor, Hargrove sat behind his mahogany desk in the dark, lit only by the glow of his computer screen. The medication logs were spread out in front of him, the ones Megan had documented in her careful handwriting. The ones that showed the discrepancies he'd spent the last 2 years building into a profitable side practice. 7 altered prescriptions. Controlled substances diverted to a private clinic in a strip mall in Converse, 15 miles outside the city. A network of 3 nurses he'd leveraged with various threats, 2 pharmacists he'd bought directly, and a billing system that routed payments through 3 different offshore accounts. $237,000 in the last year alone. It was perfect. It was clean. It was working. Until the new nurse with no real credentials started asking questions. He picked up his phone. Made the first call to a board member he knew from his country club. Made the second call to a lawyer who specialized in nursing board complaints. Started making the calculations about how quickly he could build a case for her incompetence. Started thinking about who among the residents would be willing to provide a witness statement in exchange for favorable rotation assignments. The challenge, he thought, was that she never reacted. Never defended herself. Never gave him anything to work with except her silence. He didn't understand that her silence wasn't weakness. It was a different kind of weapon entirely. The reassignment notice appeared in the staff portal at 11:22 p.m. on a Tuesday, 3 days after the chart incident. Effective immediately, Megan was being transferred from the VA ward to pediatrics and maternity. No explanation. No advance notice. Just a notification that her badge access to the 4th floor had been revoked and her new shift rotation would begin the following morning. She stared at the screen in her apartment, the blue light casting her face in sharp relief, and felt nothing. Not anger. Not surprise. Just the kind of clarity that comes from recognizing the shape of a trap closing around you. She'd seen this before, in different uniforms, in different buildings. This was how institutions removed obstacles. Not with violence. With precision. With paperwork. The pediatrics wing smelled like formula and industrial bleach, a combination that clung to her scrubs like an accusation. Children's laughter echoed down corridors painted in soft pastels, a deliberate contrast to the concrete reality of their illnesses. On her first day, Megan moved through the ward with the same practiced efficiency she'd brought to every station in this hospital, checking vitals on a 4-year-old with pneumonia, adjusting for drip rates on a 7-month-old with failure to thrive, documenting every observation with the methodical precision that had defined her career. The nursing staff here barely acknowledged her arrival. Word traveled fast in hospitals. Everyone knew that working with Megan O'Brien was career-adjacent to working with a target. By Wednesday afternoon, her pharmacy access was gone. She discovered this when she tried to retrieve a routine antibiotic for a pediatric infection and found her credentials rejected at the stockroom door. The system error message glowed red against the glass. It wasn't a glitch. It was deliberate. Someone in administration had manually restricted her access to controlled substance logs, medication histories, and inventory records. The same record she'd been reviewing when Hargrove caught her 3 weeks earlier. She stood in front of the locked door for exactly 5 seconds, then turned and walked to the pediatric station, where she could accomplish the task through standard protocols. The nurse manager, Janet Corelli, watched this exchange from across the room, her expression carefully neutral. Everyone was watching. Everyone was waiting to see if the new nurse would finally crack. She didn't crack. She adapted. The same way she'd adapted to sand in every piece of equipment, to 70-hour rotations, to the sound of mortars in the distance. Adaptation was a skill. Emotion was a luxury. Megan moved through her pediatrics rotation with the same quiet authority she'd brought to every crisis she'd ever faced, and if the work felt beneath her qualifications, if every interaction felt like a careful game of evasion, she gave no sign. Her hands remained steady. Her voice remained level. She documented her observations with the same attention to detail that had once meant the difference between a soldier living or dying in a field hospital outside Baghdad. The overheard conversation happened on Thursday, in the staff lounge during the afternoon shift change. Megan was retrieving her lunch from the refrigerator when she heard the voices from behind the partially closed door, 2 nurses from the administrative support team, voices low but audible in the fluorescent-lit space. "Someone from administration called my department yesterday. asking about her references, her previous employment history. What did you tell them? That I didn't know her before she started here. But they kept asking. Like they were looking for something specific. Something that didn't add up. Megan closed the refrigerator door slowly. The sound of the seal breaking seemed impossibly loud. Neither nurse noticed her presence. She walked past them without acknowledgement, the lunch container cool against her palm, her jaw locked at an angle that would have concerned most people. Most people. Not her. The trembling wasn't fear. It was recognition. This was the phase where the narrative got constructed. Where inconsistencies got planted. Where a file with gaps became a liability. Dr. Patricia Valdez, the board member Hargrove had called in, scheduled Megan's performance review for the following Tuesday. The email arrived with a formal courtesy that made it dangerous. Routine assessment. Standard protocol for new staff members at the 3-month mark. Megan read it once and filed it mentally under developments to acknowledge but not resist. Fighting the machinery now would only accelerate its mechanisms. Better to move through the process like smoke. Answer every question with precision. Provide no ammunition. Give them nothing but the shell of competence they could never actually question. The review took place in a conference room on the administration floor, the kind of space designed to make conversations feel official. Sterile. Documented. Dr. Valdez sat across from her with a tablet and an expression that suggested she already knew the answers to the questions she was about to ask. A board member didn't conduct routine reviews in person unless something specific had prompted the inquiry. Hargrove's name didn't appear anywhere in the process, but it hung in the room like smoke. Your previous employment history shows a gap of 7 years, Dr. Valdez began, her fingers poised over the tablet. Between your discharge from active duty and your enrollment in the RN program. Can you walk me through that period? Megan met her gaze without flinching. Medical rehabilitation. Physical therapy. Adjustment to civilian life. That's quite vague. What specific facility? Private care. Personal recovery. Valdez's fingers tapped against the tablet, a small sound, but distinct. Your references are limited to military medical contacts. No civilian healthcare experience prior to Mercy General. That's unusual. I was direct entry. Clinical education through accelerated RN track. My references reflect the physicians who supervised my training. Some board members have expressed concern about your fit with civilian hospital protocols. Whether you're adjusting appropriately to our institutional structure. There it was. The real question beneath the official ones. Not whether she could do the work. Whether she could be controlled by the work. Whether she understood the hierarchy that positioned her beneath people like Hargrove, regardless of actual competence. Megan kept her voice level. I follow all protocols. I document everything. I haven't had a single incident or complaint outside of the recent circumstances with Dr. Hargrove. Which brings me to the medication log discrepancies you reported. Valdez looked up from the tablet. Dr. Hargrove indicates that your observations may have been the result of misunderstanding our documentation systems. That you may have interpreted standard procedures as irregularities. I documented what I observed. But you're new to civilian environments. It's possible you're applying military standards to civilian processes. That mistakes might seem intentional when they're simply procedural differences. The silence in the room lasted exactly 3 seconds. Megan had learned to count silence the way other people counted breaths. 3 seconds was enough time to understand what was happening. The narrative was being rewritten. Her documentation of actual inconsistencies was being reframed as the misinterpretation of a newcomer unfamiliar with civilian operations. The machinery was working exactly as designed. Plant doubt. Create confusion. Make the witness seem unreliable. I stand by my documentation, Megan said finally. Valdez made a note on her tablet. Not an angry note. Not an aggressive note. Just a clinical observation. The kind that would appear in a file somewhere. The kind that would support whatever conclusion had already been decided. We'll continue to monitor your adjustment. In the meantime, remain focused on your assigned ward rotation. Let the administration handle policy-level concerns. Translation: stop asking questions. Stop documenting. Stop being a problem. Megan stood and walked out of the conference room without additional comment. The hallway outside was empty, antiseptic smelling, lined with doors that all looked the same. She moved through it like a ghost, present but untethered. The challenge coin in her scrub pocket seemed to weigh more than usual. By Friday, access to room 347 had been restricted. She discovered this when she attempted to check on the Army Ranger during afternoon rounds. Security was stationed outside the door, unusual, unnecessary, and entirely the result of Hargrove's direct orders. The guard, a man named Patterson whom she'd seen during various emergency responses, looked genuinely uncomfortable. Dr. Hargrove's orders. Assigned personnel only. You're not on his authorization list. Through the reinforced window in the door, she could see the Ranger. His color was improving. The swelling around his jaw had decreased. His hand moved slowly to the surgical site on his throat, fingers trailing across the healing line of stitches, and then his eyes found hers across the distance. Recognition. Acknowledgement. Something that looked like an apology. Megan held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then turned and walked away. The sound of her shoes on the tile was the only thing that followed her. That evening, Dr. Patel found her in the parking lot as she was loading her bag into her truck. The older physician looked over her shoulder before speaking, a gesture that suggested caution. Whatever you saw. Whatever you found. Hargrove knows you know. He's not done with this. I know. No, you don't understand. Patel's voice dropped lower. I heard him on the phone this afternoon. Calling someone at the hospital board. Calling someone else at the state licensing board. He's building something. Not just to get you fired. To make sure you don't work in any hospital in Texas after this. Megan felt the weight of that statement settle across her shoulders like body armor. She'd expected retaliation. She'd expected pressure. But this level of institutional coordination was different. This was the kind of thing that required resources. Connections. The kind of power that only came from being part of a system that protected its own. Thank you for telling me, Megan said. I shouldn't know what I know. But I was field medicine. Same as you. Patel's eyes met hers, and in that moment, there was a flash of recognition, the kind that only happened between people who had seen the same things, carried the same weight. Whatever comes next, you're not as alone as you think. She left before Megan could respond. The parking lot was beginning to fill with rain, the kind that came fast to San Antonio in late spring, heavy enough that it sounded like static against the concrete. Megan sat in her truck, engine off, watching the rain sheet down the windshield. The city lights blurred through the water, reds and yellows and whites, all running together, all becoming the same color. 7 years ago, she'd thought that leaving this life behind meant she could be ordinary. That silence and competence would be enough. That no one would ever look closely enough to see what remained underneath. She was wrong about that. People always looked. They just looked for different things. 3 days passed in a kind of suspension, not time, but the space between heartbeats. Megan worked the night shift on the VA ward, the one Hargrove had reassigned her to with surgical precision, stripping away her access to the good floors, the surgical teams, the cases where she might prove her value. Now she pushed a med cart through hallways that smelled like antiseptic and defeat, 40 patients across 5 rooms, 2 nurses and 1 resident who looked like he'd never seen a real emergency. The shift began at 11, and by 11:47 the fluorescent lights buzzed their endless mechanical song above a ward that was about to collapse. The call button in room 347 lit up like an alarm. Not a normal call, an emergency signal, the kind that made every nurse's muscle memory activate. Megan was 4 rooms away when she heard it. She moved on instinct, the kind of movement that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. Her left leg, the rebuilt one from the IED blast that had shattered bone and confidence, carried her across the polished tile without hesitation. The Army Ranger's room was chaos in monochrome. The mute soldier, the one who'd watched her for 3 weeks with eyes that held recognition she couldn't name, was turning blue. His head was thrown back, his mouth open like a fish pulled from water. Gasping. Not breathing. The resident stood frozen beside the bed, staring at the monitor, at the patient, at his own useless hands. One of the nurses was calling for Hargrove. The other was backing toward the door. Megan assessed in 2 seconds flat. The Ranger's trachea, damaged years ago in combat, weakened by scarring, had collapsed completely. The crushed airway was an anatomical nightmare. She couldn't intubate. A tube wouldn't fit through tissue that had already been destroyed once. The patient would be dead in 90 seconds. Maybe less. She moved to the crash cart. Her hands found the scalpel like muscle memory finding a weapon. The blade was cold, precise, made for cutting. She grabbed a ballpoint pen from her pocket, a cheap plastic thing, the kind that cost $1 at the hospital gift shop, and snapped the barrel clean. Air passage. That was all she needed. That was all he needed. The Ranger's neck was exposed. She could see the cricothyroid membrane, the narrow space between cartilage rings where a surgical textbook said you could cut, where you could create an airway when nature had already failed. The resident made a sound, something between a gasp and a plea. Megan ignored it. Pain was information. Speed was survival. 45 seconds. That's what it took. The scalpel bit through skin and membrane. The pen barrel slid into the opening. The Ranger gasped, a wet, glorious sound of air entering lungs. His body convulsed once, then settled. His eyes, wide and panicked, found hers and locked on with the kind of recognition that transcends language. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, he knew exactly what she was. Who she was. By 2 in the morning, Megan was standing in an administrative office that smelled like leather chairs and expensive cologne. Dr. Hargrove sat across from her with Dr. Valdez and a hospital legal counsel who kept clicking a pen like a countdown timer. The complaint was already printed, the words clinical and damning, practicing beyond scope of licensure. Unauthorized surgical procedure. Endangering patient welfare. The resident, coached by Hargrove with all the finesse of a man conducting an orchestra of lies, had provided a statement that Megan acted recklessly, ignored protocol, made decisions that a real doctor should have made. You performed a procedure, Hargrove said, his voice carrying the kind of false concern that makes skin crawl. Without proper authorization. Megan's jaw tightened. Just slightly. The kind of movement only people trained to read micro-expressions would catch. The patient was in cardiac arrest. That's not the point. Hargrove's fingers drummed the table. He'd already made 3 calls before this meeting. 3 board members. 2 of them were already talking about termination. The machinery was in motion now, and he'd built it well. The point is protocol. The point is scope. The point is that you overstepped. She didn't respond. Didn't defend. Didn't explain that she'd spent 18 months learning how to suture wounds that shouldn't have been survivable, how to work in operating theaters lit by diesel generators and mortar fire, how to make decisions in 4 seconds that meant the difference between a body going home and a body staying buried in the sand. The composure she'd built in Baghdad held firm. A mask made of steel and silence. By sunrise, it was official. The suspension letter was waiting in her personnel file. Immediate. Pending full investigation. Her credentials questioned. Her future at Mercy General terminated. She was escorted to her locker by a security guard who wouldn't meet her eyes, and into a cardboard box went the small artifacts of her civilian life, a cracked coffee mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse," a joke someone had given her on her first day, before anyone knew who she was. A wilting succulent she'd kept alive for 6 months on a shelf above her station, dropping water from a tiny paper cup every Tuesday. And the photograph. 5 soldiers in desert fatigues, standing in front of a canvas tent in Baghdad, 2007. Their names were Ahmed, Marcus, Sanchez, Rodriguez, and Cole. Ahmed's face was crossed out with marker, killed in action, 2006. Marcus, sane treatment, IED, 2007. Sanchez and Rodriguez, both crossed out in the same careful hand. Cole's face was circled, not crossed out. Cole had made it home. 1 out of 5. A 20% survival rate that had haunted her dreams for 18 years. The challenge coin hung from her keychain, tarnished silver and older than some of the soldiers in it, earned from a unit commander with hands that shook and a voice that barely worked anymore. The coin was so worn the lettering had faded almost to nothing, but she could feel the raised letters under her thumb, Operation Phantom Fury. 137 combat surgical procedures. 47 saves that the Pentagon had counted. Countless others that never made it into official statistics. She walked out through the ER bay doors into rain so heavy it looked like the sky had a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. The bus stop was a half-block away, a broken shelter with rusted poles and a bench that had been vandalized so many times the city had stopped trying to fix it. She stood under it, holding the cardboard box, watching her reflection in the puddle spreading across the pavement. The rain soaked through her jacket, the civilian one, grey and forgettable, the kind of thing nobody noticed on a bus. Her dark hair plastered to her temples. Her hand steady around the box. The photo was getting damp. She could feel it absorbing water through the cardboard. For crossed-out faces. 1 circled. The men who'd been her unit, her responsibility, the weight she carried into every hospital room. 2 of them had died on her table. 2 had died before they reached her. Cole had lived, had gone home to a wife who left him anyway, had spent the last 15 years trying to remember how to be human. The challenge coin caught the streetlight, just for a moment, before disappearing into shadow. Nobody was watching. Nobody was coming. There was only the rain and the reflection and a woman standing at a bus stop with her entire career in a cardboard box, watching her reflection dissolve in the water. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury for people who could afford to break. Her eyes remained dry. Her breathing remained steady. Her hands didn't tremble. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence that came after, not the sound of rain on metal, not the distant traffic on the San Antonio streets, but the absolute clarity of understanding that 3 days from now, everything would change. That the Army Ranger in room 347 was already making phone calls. That people with authority and rank were already being contacted. That the life she'd tried so hard to bury, the uniform she'd left in a duffel bag under her apartment bed, the medals in a box she hadn't opened since discharge, was about to walk back through the doors of Mercy General and reclaim the woman standing in the rain. Dr. Hargrove sat alone in his office at 11:24 p.m., the hospital quiet except for the distant wheeze of ventilators and the hum of the HVAC system cycling through the corridors. His computer screen glowed in the darkness, casting shadows across his face. He'd been searching for leverage, for something to bury Megan O'Brien completely, and he'd found a contact at the VA, a favor owed, a password shared, a classified file accessed that should never have been accessed. He opened the document. His hands went still. Commander. The word sat on the page like a fist. Silver Star. And below that, in crisp military language, classified surgical unit, Baghdad. Operation Phantom Fury. 47 confirmed lives saved under sustained fire. Leadership role. Classified sacrifice resulting in permanent service-ending disability. His face drained of color. The chair rolled backward as he stood, one hand braced against the desk. He'd spent 3 months trying to break a nurse. A nurse. He'd filed complaints, manipulated staff, orchestrated her suspension. He'd placed a $50 bet on her resignation. He'd knocked a lunch tray from her hands. And she'd been, the air in the office felt suddenly too thin. The next morning, the hospital's main conference room had been arranged for what was supposed to be the final hearing on Megan O'Brien's employment status. Dr. Hargrove had prepared his evidence. The resident he'd coached was ready to testify. The board members sat at the long mahogany table, folders in front of them. Megan stood at the back of the room in the same scrub she'd worn the day she was suspended, her face a perfect mask. Dr. Hargrove began his presentation. He was 10 minutes in, showing photographs of the emergency cricothyrotomy, building his case for practicing beyond her scope, when the mute Army Ranger from room 347 wheeled himself through the conference room doors. His name was Marcus Webb. He'd been silent for 548 days, that was how he counted it, every single morning, the number of days his voice had been stolen by a crushed trachea and the kind of shrapnel that didn't leave room for words. He moved the wheelchair with his own hands, arms bearing the ropey muscle of someone who'd relearned how to exist without his voice, and every person in that conference room turned to look at him. He took a breath. A long one. His chest rose and held. And then he spoke his first complete sentence in 18 months, Viper 6. The words came out rough, sandpaper through gravel, but they came out clear. The security guard standing near the back door stiffened, a Marine veteran, tattoo of the eagle, globe, an anchor visible on his forearm where his sleeve had ridden up. He stepped forward immediately, hand over his heart. "Commander O'Brien," he said, his voice sharp and formal. "That's Commander O'Brien." The board members exchanged confused glances. Dr. Hargrove's face shifted from white to grey to something that looked like the surface of the moon after impact. The doors at the far end of the conference room opened. Two-star General Catherine Reeves walked through first, uniform pressed sharp enough to cut every medal in its place, her presence making the air pressure change the way it does when a fighter jet passes overhead, that moment where the world remembers it's being observed by something larger than itself. Behind her came a Pentagon liaison in a suit that probably cost more than Hargrove's car payment, carrying a folder thick enough to be a novel. The general moved to the front of the room without being invited. She unfolded a document that had been stamped classified 3 times, then declassified once for this moment. She read aloud in a voice like burnished steel, "Commander Megan O'Brien, Silver Star, for actions during Operation Phantom Fury, Fallujah District. 47 confirmed lives saved under direct fire. Leadership role overseeing trauma surgical teams in sustained combat conditions." Pause. The general looked directly at Dr. Hargrove. Navy Cross citation, classified, but declassified for this proceeding. For sacrifice beyond expected duty. For loss that cannot be repaid. Another pause. 2 Purple Hearts. Third tour. Baghdad, Sanjin Valley deployment, Helmand Province attachments. The board members were leaning forward now, understanding blooming across their faces like flowers opening in time-lapse. And, the general continued, her eyes locked on Hargrove's, command-level clearance from JSOC for medical protocols that remain classified. Which means, Doctor, that when she performed that emergency cricothyrotomy using a ballpoint pen and a scalpel, she was operating exactly within her scope, her actual scope, which your hospital has no authority to define. The silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the general turned to Dr. Hargrove and spoke 5 words that ended his career: "You're fired. Effective immediately. The Inspector General will be investigating your medication discrepancies." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Hospital security was already moving. 2 officers, one of them the Marine vet who'd spoken Megan's rank aloud, approached Dr. Hargrove's chair. He started talking immediately, his voice climbing, words tumbling out like someone who'd just realized the floor beneath his feet had been removed. But the security team had orders. His hospital badge was deactivated on the spot. The lead officer made the call right there in the conference room, watching Hargrove's access disappear from the system in real time. His office would be sealed. His files would be inventoried by the hospital's legal team. His computer had already been collected by IT security as a precaution. They walked him out through the main corridor at 9:34 a.m., right at shift change when the hallways were fullest, nurses and residents and technicians all moving to their stations. Local news cameras caught every moment. Someone had tipped them off, probably one of the nurses who'd been documenting Hargrove's behavior in a private group chat for 6 weeks. The footage was everywhere by noon. Dr. Hargrove in his white coat, his jaw clenched, arguing with security, his voice cracking as he tried to maintain authority he no longer possessed. By that evening, the footage had gone viral. Prominent San Antonio doctor fired after bullying decorated war hero. Within 72 hours, hospital auditors found $240,000 in fraudulent prescriptions, kickbacks from pharmaceutical representatives with names and dates, and systematic medication diversion from the VA ward's most vulnerable patients. 3 board members who'd taken his calls resigned under pressure. Dr. Valdez, who'd authorized Megan's suspension without investigation, issued a public apology and announced her own retirement. The state medical board opened a criminal investigation that would eventually result in 5 years probation, permanent license revocation, and a plea deal on fraud charges, but that was all to come. For now, he was simply gone, erased from the place where he'd wielded power, and in the way of fallen authority figures, no one called. 6 weeks later, a journalist doing a follow-up story would spot him in a Houston suburb, sitting at a folding table outside a strip mall with a banner reading supplemental insurance, affordable rates. His former colleagues would recognize him in the photograph. No one would reach out. That night, after the general and the Pentagon liaison had left, after the board members had issued their formal apology and offered Megan full reinstatement with back pay, after the legal team had closed the conference room and begun the work of untangling everything Hargrove had touched, Megan stood beside Marcus Webb's hospital bed. He was still there 3 more days in the ward before transfer to VA rehab in Austin, where they wanted him to work with other vets, other soldiers who'd lost their voice. She pulled a chair close to his bed and sat down. His hand found hers immediately, palm up, the grip of someone who'd learned to communicate through touch when words had been stolen from him. On the table between them, she'd placed her challenge coin, the tarnished one she'd carried on her keychain for 7 years, worn dull by time and carried through 1,000 moments when the weight of it was the only thing keeping her tethered to who she actually was. He'd brought his own coin, placed it there beside hers when she arrived. Both of them bore the same insignia, both of them scarred by fire and time and the kind of survival that leaves marks. "They want to promote you," Marcus said. His voice was still rough, still gathering itself, but sentences were forming now where there had only been silence. "Nurse manager. VA ward. You could implement new protocols. Clean up everything he contaminated." She nodded. "I'm considering it." He squeezed her hand once. "You should take it." The window beside them framed San Antonio's light spreading across the night like a constellation someone had dropped into the city and forgotten to collect. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. They didn't need to. They understood the particular silence that comes from having been tested by fire and found themselves intact, scarred but intact. Finally, he turned his head to look at her directly. "I'm heading to Austin next week. VA rehab facility. They want me to work with other vets, folks who've lost their voice, one way or another." His eyes held hers. "You coming to visit?" For the first time since she'd walked into that hospital 3 months ago, Megan smiled. Not the mask, not the composure, but a real smile, small and genuine and carrying the weight of everything that had just been reclaimed. "Yeah," she said. "I will." 3 months later, she returned to Mercy General wearing new scrubs with nurse manager, VA ward embroidered on the pocket in thread the color of old gold. The hallways were the same and completely different. Staff members nodded with genuine respect instead of pity masked as politeness. Younger nurses stopped by her office with questions about trauma protocols, about crisis response, about the things she'd been quietly studying her entire career. She'd implemented a new tracking system for the VA medication logs that had already caught 2 discrepancy patterns at facilities across Texas, the same patterns Hargrove had been manufacturing for profit. Dr. Patel visited her office on her 2nd week back, bringing coffee that was actually good instead of the burnt dishwater the hospital cafeteria produced. They sat together and talked about Baghdad, not the operational details, but the weight of it, the way certain songs could bring back the smell of gunpowder and antiseptic, the way you never fully disconnected from the people you tried to save and couldn't. That evening, she visited room 347, which now held a different patient with a different trauma, but Marcus Webb was there in the hallway outside, steady on his feet now, his voice gathering strength with each passing week. They sat in the family waiting area and placed their challenge coins on the table between them, both tarnished, both earned in fire, both a testament to surviving the unsurvivable. He told her about the rehab program in Austin, about the other vets he was working with, about how teaching them to find their voice again was teaching him the same thing. The challenge coin caught the fluorescent light and threw it back, gleaming dull gold against the hospital's white laminate. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. That night, she returned to her apartment where the succulent had grown new leaves and the photograph of 5 soldiers now sat in a frame on her bookshelf instead of hidden in a cardboard box. She opened her laptop and began drafting a proposal for a veteran-to-civilian medical transition program, something that could help other soldiers navigate the space between their uniform and their next identity. Outside her window, San Antonio's lights spread across the night like someone had finally turned on the city's actual constellation. She wasn't hiding anymore. Her rank was no longer classified. Her sacrifice was no longer silent. And when she returned to the hospital for her morning shift, walking through the same fluorescent corridors, her limp still visible and her hand still scarred, people stepped aside to let the commander pass. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. We post stories about real heroism every single week. Like this video if you believe the quietest people in the room are often the ones holding everything together. And comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your actual value? Because those stories matter. Those moments matter. And so do you.